Mics, can you guys hear me? No? Kind of? Okay, well, I'll just talk loud. Okay, thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Bucci. Dr. Stephen Bucci was raised in Dobbs Ferry, New York, and entered the United States Military Academy at West Point. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science in National Security and Public Affairs, and then went on to earn an MA and PhD from the University of South Carolina, both in international relations. Bucci is a graduate of the U.S. Army War College, the Hellenic Army War College in Thessaloniki, Greece, and the Department of State Senior Seminar. His highest award is the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. He also has the Bronze Star, the Special Forces Tab, Master Parachutist Wings, and the Order of Nam Farishi, First Class. Commissioned in the infantry, Bucci served in various leadership positions in the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, before joining the 5th Special Forces. From that point in his career, he served in Greece as a detachment commander at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, as a brigade operations officer, and in the Foreign Area Officer Program. He completed 4 years of graduate study, language training at the Defense Language Institute, and regional training in the Balkans. At the JFK Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, Bucci taught European studies, foreign policy, international relations theory, and development studies for the Army Special Operations community. Bucci moved to the 7th Special Forces, conducting numerous counter-drug and development deployments across Latin America. Dr. Bucci was selected to be the first ever resident defense attaché in Tirana, Albania. In the period 94 to 96, he planned, coordinated, and oversaw 9 combined exercises and numerous other high-level activities. Moving to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to command the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Special Forces, he led major operational deployments to Eastern Africa, the Persian Gulf, and South Asia, including Operation Desert Thunder. Post-command, he served as the defense attaché in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Bucci assumed the duties of the military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, Donald H. Rumsfeld, on the 1st of July 2001, and served in that capacity through the 9/11 attack and the global war on terrorism. While there, he led a team of 25 other colonels to Baghdad to directly assist the coalition Provisional Authority leadership in the final 6-month period leading to the transfer of sovereignty, serving as a military assistant to the deputy administrator. He retired from active duty in the spring of 2005, but continued serving as a staff director of the immediate office of the secretary and a presidential appointee as a member of the Senior Executive Service. He presently serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, one of the 4 components of the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland and America Security Activities. In this position, he oversees the policy issues involving the defense domains, National Guard operational issues, domestic counterterrorism, and readiness exercises. Dr. Bucci and his wife, the former Suzanne Sloan of Bettendorf, Iowa, have 2 sons, Peter, who with his wife Jennifer live in Atlanta, and Philip, who is attending the military academy. We are proud to have Dr. Bucci here with us tonight. Please help me in welcoming him to Iowa State University.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here tonight. It's a great opportunity to come here and speak. As Samantha mentioned, I'm married to an Iowa girl, and therefore I have been a follower of all sorts of Iowa-related sports activities, even when I was not so inclined. I'm honored to be here in Ames in Cyclone Country. Sort of nice. I mentioned to a couple of folks when I arrived last night, it's a little confusing getting into this building with all the construction and everything else, and there was about 1,000 students out here going to something down that way. And as I wandered about with that clueless old guy with the suitcase look, they all were very helpful in getting me to the registration desk so I could get settled. When I got the idea, when Samantha asked me to come out and speak, and I had to think about what I was going to talk about, and I decided to talk about weapons of mass destruction. And I had kind of a flashback to when I was a lieutenant in the Army, which was a long time ago. I thought about the acronym NBC, which is what we called that issue set back then. It stands for nuclear, biological, and chemical. But what it really stood for most of us in the Army, was nobody cares. Because for most of us, NBC about as far as we got into it was we had to pass a test to get our protective mask on and cleared within 9 seconds so we could get a certain kind of skill badge that everybody wanted to have. And the only thing we ever did with our protective suits was the guys would kind of steal them out of the little bags and ride motorcycles in the wintertime because they were really, really warm. It was kind of messy if you had to lay the bike down, though, because they were like 2 pieces of cloth with charcoal between them. So it kind of made a mess when you fell over on the bike. But we really didn't do much else. And the thought struck me was, boy, things have really changed a lot. Right now, at the national level, we take this issue extremely seriously. Of the 15 national planning scenarios, which are set-piece events that the entire federal government plans against now, 11 of them are related to what we now call CBRNE, C-B-R-N-E, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and high-yield explosives. That's the present acronym that we use. And for those of us in the Homeland Defense business, which is the Department of Defense's piece of the whole greater Homeland Security mission, these kind of events, WMD events, are probably the thing we spend the most time on and are the most concerned about. What I wanted to talk about tonight is 3 things. First, I want to talk about some myths that are involved with weapons of mass destruction, because there are a lot of them out there. Then I'm going to talk about what the Department of Defense does should one of these events unfortunately occur here in the homeland. And then lastly, and very quickly, I'm going to ask some things of you. Now, at the end of this, I'll be happy to take questions from anybody about whatever you want to ask me about, either the military in general or this particular subject. And as I told the organizers, you guys just fire away with your questions at the end. Don't worry about whether it's appropriate or whether I can talk about it. Let me handle that part of it. So you just ask the question. If I can't answer it because of either security reasons or lack of knowledge, I'll be happy to explain to you which one it is. And I'll also try and explain what is Bucci's opinion and what is government policy. Okay, the myths. What I want to do is not downplay the threat to the United States, because it is a big threat. Weapons of mass destruction are probably our biggest concern, because we have enemies out there who are trying desperately to get their hands on weapons of mass destruction to use against us. That's not some implied threat that we have analyzed and put on the enemy. It is what they have said in their own public statements and their own declarations, both publicly and things that we have obtained when they talk to each other. So the threat is real. It would be foolish and dangerous of me to try and imply anything less than that. However, there is a heck of a lot of hype out there about weapons of mass destruction that causes a lot of fear that is not appropriate. We need to address this issue at the correct level so that our response will be the correct one, not one that's driven by something other than fact. The threat has to be framed accurately if we're going to respond correctly. So, let me go through a couple of myths with you with regard to weapons of mass destruction. The first one, which is frankly our worst case scenario, the one we spend the most time worrying about, is a 10 KT nuclear detonation somewhere in America. And the myth is that getting nuclear weapons, or that nuclear weapons can be easily manufactured and smuggled into the United States for use. Well, it's really hard to make nuclear weapons. I know that sounds kind of trite, and some of you might be students in that area, and you can probably try and have an argument with me about it. But let me go through a few things, and those of you that are more expert than I am in the scientific realm, if you want to discuss it with me in the question and answer period, we can do that. First, the bad guys are going to have to figure out how to make a nuclear device. And again, they would like to. Now, you can obtain those blueprints from somewhere, or you can get them off the internet. There's a fellow named A.Q. Khan, who's a hero of the Pakistani people, because he's the guy who got Pakistan their nuclear weapon. He had a little business going for a while, trying to sell that technology to other people. He is now in house arrest inside Pakistan. They don't want to throw him in jail because he's a hero to the country, but he was doing some nefarious things. However, and that actually started before 9/11, by the way, and we were tracking him before 9/11. But if you want to go that route, if you're a terrorist, it's a hugely expensive endeavor. I mean, we're talking unbelievable sums of money that he was charging for that technology. And we think he did sell it to a few people, most of them nation states, but not enough to, not to any particular terrorist group. Now, if you want to go the other route and try and get it off the internet, well, some of those things on the internet are accurate and some of them are not. In fact, most of them are not. They are like way off base. So again, some of you have more faith in the internet than I do probably, but we can discuss that in the question and answer period also. But let's say that terrorists get the blueprints. They have the design to build an improvised nuclear device. Well, you still need a pretty significant staff to do that. You need PhD level physicists, you need machinists, explosive experts, technicians. All of that has to be put together as a team. And again, this is not terribly easy. All the disgruntled former Russian nuclear experts that everybody likes to point at mostly have been reemployed at this point, and actually very few of them would be terribly desirous of working for Al-Qaeda because they have their own issues to deal with in this regard. So the supply of these kind of people that are out there floating around is pretty limited, fortunately. The other thing, which harkens back to one of my other times in the past when I was a Special Forces officer, is every time you open up to bring another person into your little inner circle, your operational security goes down the tubes. So you're taking a big chance every time you try and bring in another one of those subject matter experts. And also, a lot of those subject matter experts may not be who they purport to be. They may either be completely bogus or they may at least be considerably less capable in their scientific abilities than they portray themselves. So what happens next? Well, next, you've got to come up with the material to make the weapon. And sure, most of you know that you need to have highly enriched weapons-grade uranium or plutonium. And while on 24 and the unit, it's pretty easy to find that stuff. In real life, fortunately, it's not. They don't occur naturally, so you've got to find a way to covertly mine it, mill it, convert it, and enrich it. And all that requires a pretty good industrial base to pull off. Most nation states, several of them who would love to do that, are still having problems doing it. And they're a lot more capable of doing that. They've got their own sovereign territory to work in than the terrorist groups. So fortunately, it is not a particularly easy thing to do. You could, I suppose, obtain the materials from another source, from a nation that has some, and there are those who are very concerned about that. We all are. But the international effort to thwart that kind of proliferation is extremely intense. Pretty much every intel and police agency out there in the world, other than the ones who are honest-to-God bad guys themselves, are keyed to pick up on the movement of that kind of material. And when we get any sort of whiff that that's going on, it's jumped on with a very swift and pervasive response. Okay, next, if you get the material, you've got to construct it. The construction of a nuclear device is not the same as just as the guy in New York did here just recently, taking a bunch of black powder and cramming it into a can. The construction of a nuclear device, the casings and the connections have to be extremely precise. If you don't get them to that unbelievably high tolerance of precision, it's not going to work. You're going to have a non-detonation or possibly a suboptimal detonation that will probably occur when you don't want it to. So it's very difficult to actually build that. But let's say they've gotten all this. They've gotten the blueprints, they've put together the team, they've somehow gotten the fissionable material, and they've built a crude device. And that's a lot of assuming, but let's just assume they have. They still have to get it into the United States. Now, our detection and deterrence technologies, which I'll talk about in the specifics a little more later, are in place specifically to keep improvised nuclear devices from coming in here. It's actually pretty good. I won't say it's foolproof. It's not airtight. It's not 100%. And I'll talk about the specific programs. But it is enough of a deterrence, we feel, that the bad guys are very reluctant to try and pierce it. Why? If they got to the point in our little scenario here where they actually had a device, that becomes an extremely valuable item to them. And they are not going to take too much of a chance of trying to get that in unless they have pretty much a sure thing on getting it through. They do not want to take a chance on losing it. Here's a corollary to myth one. Why can't they just simply get one of those suitcase nukes that everybody talks about are always floating around the black market? Well, first of all, they're not suitcase nukes. They're actually rucksack nukes. I used to carry one when I was a Special Forces officer. They're pretty big and heavy, and the ones that we're talking about like that are not 10 KT devices. They're more like a 0.01 to 0.1 KTs. It's considerably smaller. If a 10 KT can take out a quarter of a decent-sized city, these rucksack nukes are designed to take out a bridge, a tunnel, or a dam. They're specifically aimed at, it's a really big bomb. It just happens to be, they do it so you can carry it around in one rucksack. Now, having said that, the one report that was made, or one announcement that was made by a Russian official a couple of years ago, and he said, we lost about 100 of those. We don't know where they are. That has never been corroborated by anyone. There was just that one utterance on it. And we've never found any of them floating around anywhere on the black market. So frankly, we don't know for sure if there's any of them out there. There could be zero. On the other hand, these devices are actually kind of old. They're actually like 1960s technology, and the storage and handling of them requires some pretty specific and pretty stringent levels of tolerance that if they're floating around on a black market, it's very unlikely that they have been meeting. So if those devices do exist out there, they are probably significantly degraded by this time and might not work at all, or at least would work at a suboptimal level. Okay, so conclusion of myth one, is it likely? No. Is it possible? Sure. There's always that possibility, and that's why it remains our number one concern. But it is not something that somebody could just decide, I think I'm going to go build a nuke and put it together and get it in here and set it off. It'd be quite a difficult task. Okay, related to that is myth two. Everybody know what RDDs are? Radiological dispersal devices, more commonly known as dirty bombs. Some people think those are just a smaller nuclear weapon. Well, they're really not. They're just a conventional bomb with a bunch of radioactive material attached to it, so when it goes off, it spreads it around. Frankly, dirty bombs have very little lethality beyond the conventional explosive lethality that they carry with them. The dangerous levels of radiation occur within that explosive lethality. So if you're in there, you're going to be dead anyway. You might be a dirty corpse, but you're still a corpse. An RDD, I know that sounds kind of callous. I apologize for that, but that's the reality. We're talking about weapons of mass destruction here. And an RDD, frankly, is not a weapon of mass destruction in the sense of a 10 KT nuclear weapon. There can be, depending on the quality and quantity of the radioactive material that's used, there can be some plume that comes from it that will cause some radioactive contamination, but it is generally very negligible or very minimal, and we have found through the testing and exercising we've done, it'll probably be at a level that frankly will be handled by local authorities, maybe with a little help from the state, but will probably not require any sort of mobilization of resources from the federal level. The bad part about RDDs is, one, they're a lot more likely than a true nuke because they're a lot easier to make. You just have to get a bunch of conventional explosives and get some radioactive material from a medical device or something like that and strap it all together and set it off. So they're a lot easier to make, therefore they're more likely to occur. The danger is, besides the higher likelihood, is the fear. People don't understand it. They think if it's radioactive that, my gosh, I'm going to start growing things out of my forehead and bad things are going to happen to me. Fortunately, if we can get some education going, and talks like mine are part of that this is not that big a deal. We do have medical responses to radiation sickness that we can bring in there because it's generally not a huge number of people. It isn't hundreds of thousands of people that are affected. It'd probably be hundreds. And we have more than enough of the medication to address that. So with education and prompt medical care, we feel that RDDs will probably stay a very important and significant event, but not the kind that would cause the mobilization of the whole country. So again, a much smaller need for response. Okay, the next third myth is one of my favorites. It's a multi-part one, and it involves something called red mercury. This is another internet thing. Some people think red mercury is a way to refine fissionable material, to enrich uranium, for instance. Some people think it is a fissionable material. Some people think they're not really sure what it does, but it's clearly needed to produce nuclear weapons. Red mercury does not exist. Right? It is a complete fiction. The only thing that we could find in all the research is it might have been a code word for something in the Soviet nuclear program as far back as the 50s, or it could, the whole idea of it could have been created from the fact that at some point the Soviets used regular mercury, just the silver kind, to clean off fuel rods. I mean, literally like do maintenance on them, clean the dirt off of them. And afterwards, the mercury supposedly had sort of a reddish tinge to it. Didn't change the mercury at all. Didn't make it dangerous or anything like that. It was just used as a maintenance tool. Those are the only things we could find. Now, I have to tell you, we do chase down any rumor of, on the black market of somebody saying they're moving red mercury, they're trying to sell red mercury. Not that we're worried about red mercury, but we're worried that it could be something else. The bad guys who are talking about it might not know what the heck they have either. So we do check it out and make sure that it is not some other substance that could be dangerous that we're looking at. Okay, the next one, depleted uranium from old tank rounds can be used to become fissionable again, or because they're so harmful in and of themselves, they're very useful in some sort of weapon of mass destruction. Well, both these premises are false. You can't re-enrich depleted uranium. It doesn't work that way. And it is not harmful in and of itself. We had to do a lot of research on this because back a couple of years ago when I was in Bosnia, there was a big scare about a bunch of Italian soldiers who had been stationed in Bosnia after the war, who suddenly, all these guys from the same unit got cancer. They were young guys. It was clearly an anomaly. It wasn't just a naturally occurring thing. And the Italian government's initial answer was, well, that's because they were around all that depleted uranium the Americans shot during the war. Nice try, Italian government, but it really wasn't our fault. As it turns out, those guys had all cleaned their weapons with benzene. And if you've lived in Europe, I don't mean gasoline, because they call that benzene over there. I mean the chemical benzene in its pure form, which is an unbelievably huge carcinogen. So it didn't have anything to do with the depleted uranium, but in response to the media about that, we did a lot of research, we checked it out, and basically the only way depleted uranium rounds can hurt you is if you ground them up into a powder and ate large quantities of it. Eventually you would get some sort of stomach problem. So as long as you don't do that, you're okay. The only real danger, or the only thing that depleted uranium rounds would help you with if you were building a weapon, is you'd have a bunch of really heavy chunks of metal attached to your weapon, because depleted uranium is really heavy. And when your bomb went off, it sent a bunch of heavy metal chunks flying around, which has some benefit if you're the bomb maker, but not in the sense we're talking about here. Okay, let's shift to chemical and biological weapons. Myth number 5 is that chemical and biological weapons can easily be manufactured and used in the United States. Well, this myth has a couple of problems with it. One is, not unlike nuclear weapons, it's really difficult to make a good chemical or biological weapon. It is technologically hard to do. It's easier than making a nuke, but it's still pretty tough. Even if you have the money, facilities, time, and expertise, like, for instance, the Shinriko had in Japan, where they made the nerve gas, executing a really effective mass attack using chemical or biological weapons is tough. I mean, it's not bad if you're trying to kill one person. If you're trying to have the effect of hundreds or thousands of people, it's a little more difficult to do, mostly because it's very difficult to weaponize that stuff, fortunately. Second, frankly, it's a lot easier and more effective, if effectiveness is defined as the number of people you kill with your device, to use conventional explosives. If you think back, the Oklahoma City bombing killed a heck of a lot more people than the Washington, D.C. anthrax mailings. Chemical and biological attacks have proven to be, while frightening, particularly ineffective as weapons of mass destruction. And additionally, if you look at the chemical IEDs, there have been a couple of them that we found in Iraq. The bad guys have tried to get chlorine and use that in some of their improvised explosive devices, and most of them have blown up, and basically all the chemical part of the bomb just sort of dissipates when the explosion goes off. They kill the chemical with the explosion. The only time we've had any casualties at all over there was with some of our bomb disposal people who have come up after the fact and are rooting around in a hole doing their forensic job, and a couple of them got a little sick to their stomach from the chlorine. So there were no lasting chemical weapons casualties from it. And it's basically pretty hard to figure out how much boom to mix with your chemical to get it to work right. It's that weaponization part of it that's very difficult. Third is it's dangerous to try and make chemical and biological weapons. It's dangerous for the people making it. The terrorists, because they are generally small numbers of people, cellular organizations, have shown themselves to be a little reluctant to put their non-scientific operator types at risk by getting them to fool around with this stuff, because it can kill them. Unless you have really high-quality labs available to you, you're really sort of playing with fire, literally. And in addition to that, most of the previous attempts at making this stuff to cook it have failed. They haven't come up with what they wanted to. And terrorist groups, being inherently conservative organizations, now we don't necessarily think of them that way, they're very conservative religiously, but they're also very conservative in their techniques. I mean, every once in a while you get a spike like the 9/11 attacks where you get somebody thinking out of the box. But most of them know conventional explosives, and they feel that's their best. Again, I'm not trying to make a pun. That's the best bang for the buck. And just a word real quickly about the ricin incident that recently occurred in the Las Vegas area is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The chef there did more damage to himself than he did to anybody else. And in fact, what he did make, while dangerous, was not something that would have been easily weaponized at all. And in fact, nobody else in the hotel, rooms right around him, nobody else was hurt by it, because the stuff, it doesn't make a really good mass weapon, fortunately. So again, the conclusion with this one is it's very possible, because the bad guys are really trying hard to get this stuff and to find a way to use it effectively. It is still not very likely, because fortunately they haven't been successful in their efforts yet. Again, we continue to watch it. Related to that, we have that the internet, this is myth number 6, The internet provides easy access to effective cookbooks and recipes for making chemical and biological weapons. Sorry, but that's false too. Most of the recipes, if you will, that are out there are singularly ineffective. They don't produce what they're supposed to produce. They're still pretty dangerous for the chef. So if any of you are thinking of trying to cook something up, I wouldn't advise it because, again, you'll probably end up like the ricin guy. And what they do have recipes for are generally, again, not effective as mass weapons. An example is contact poisons. There's a lot of recipes on the internet for contact poisons. And I suppose if you want to get rid of one person, go for it and give it a try. That becomes a law enforcement issue. That's not Department of Defense. So, but as a mass weapon, contact poisons just have not panned out. And again, it's because there's a lot of bad guys out there trying. It just hasn't worked. Another example is the biological agents. Most of the recipes out there do not come up with the toxins that they say they will come up with. And there's things about mixing dead rats with different chemicals and putting them in jars and putting them under your porch for 3 weeks, and at the end of it you got a biological weapon. Well, yeah, I suppose if you drank it, but it's not something that's going to be easily usable in a mass event. Again, related to that, and this is myth 7, that the American water system is very vulnerable to this kind of attack. Well, most of the water systems in the United States, particularly those connected with metropolitan areas, are huge. They are generally not right there in the city. There's not too many people like dipping their cups into the reservoir and drinking right out of it. And they have enormous natural, mostly natural, and some man-made purification and safety measures attached to them. So while you might be able to throw a satchel full of some bad stuff into a reservoir in upstate New York, for instance, however, by the time it gets to New York City, likely target, the volume of water that it's dissolved in is so great, and the time that has elapsed between when you threw it in and when somebody consumes it will generally discount that lethality. So it's really not a good bet for an attack. Now, there are ways you can affect our water system, but frankly, they take a little more technological knowledge and expertise to do than, fortunately, we found most of the bad guys have. So it's a pretty much a niche kind of thing. You have to be a water system expert to figure it out. But it is a danger, and again, that is one of the areas we continue to watch and monitor with, and that's, again, our brothers in Homeland Security, not a DOD issue. Okay, last myth, that the huge number of container ships that come into the United States every day make this an enormous vulnerability that is easily exploited. Okay, this one's partially true, right? It is an enormous vulnerability. It is not easily exploited, fortunately. It's not an accident that we have not had an attack through that means since 9/11. We are working very hard to add to our measures to protect that area because we do see it as a vulnerability. Right now, we don't check every container that comes into the United States. If we did, global commerce would come to a screeching halt. Not just here, it would affect the entire world. And we just haven't been willing to do that. Now, to mitigate those things, we've got a bunch of programs. I'm just going to mention 3 of them. One is called the Container Security Initiative. It is worked by the Customs and Border Protection folks, and they go out to, right now, 58 foreign ports. They have their people stationed overseas, and through that program, they check actually 86% of the containers, each container that comes into the United States. That's not 100%, but that's a pretty high number. Next, the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office has an initiative called the Secure Freight Initiative, and that has monitoring devices in foreign ports. They check in 3 ports that are our highest level of commerce with. They check 100% of those containers for radioactivity. and are now setting up the monitors in 3 other major ports, and they're going to continue expanding that program as time and equipment allow. So again, not 100%, but they get a lot of it. And then the last one is a lot less high-tech than those. It's called the International Port Security Program. It's run by the Coast Guard, where they target specifically countries or organizations that have relatively lax security, and they go overseas to those people, both companies and countries, and offer assistance visits and assessments to help them up their security. Now again, that's not going to get everybody to 100%, but every little bit of added security benefits us. Why? Because when you overlay these different programs, it becomes like a mesh going in different directions. And yeah, there's still holes there, but those holes get smaller and smaller with each program that we use to overlay it. And it makes it more and more difficult for the bad guys to get through. Now, having said that, we have significantly reduced the threat in that area and in others that I'm not going to go into tonight. But we have to remain vigilant. We used to have a saying in the Army that you could have 100 attaboys and 1 aw shoot, and they all go away. And that's pretty applicable in the counterterrorism arena. The bad guys only have to be right once. We have to be right every time. And that's a tough standard to live by. But the entire team of federal organizations, all the different cabinet agencies that are involved, all work together. I was very heartened when I took this job 14, 15 months ago that there was very little of that sort of stereotypical thing everybody thinks about Washington organizations. Hey, that's my area, stay out of it. You can't come in here, and all that kind of nonsense. Very little of that in regard to Homeland Security. Pretty much everybody is reaching out to everybody else and saying, hey, you need to help us, we need to help you. And we do that very well. The other one, and this is odd because you very seldom hear anybody say anything nice about the intelligence community, our biggest defense against terrorism is the fact that we have a really good and functional intelligence community. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. You're talking about something that literally is looking for the needle in the haystack and involves an awful lot of speculation, educated guesswork, and things of that nature, and it's very, very tough to be right all the time. But those folks do a heck of a job. We've made a lot of improvements since 9/11. We have fusion centers. That was one of the things I visited this morning down at Camp Dodge, was the Iowa State Fusion Center, which brings together law enforcement, intelligence agencies, private sector, all sorts of things to try and kludge together every bit of information that we can get to protect this country. And we have those fusion centers all over the country in every state, and a lot of them have regional counterparts below the state. That being said, what happens if the bad guys are successful? What are we going to do? Well, let me just real quickly cover some of the things that the Department of Defense does in the hopefully unlikely possibility that one of these weapons of mass destruction actually gets in and is detonated. Well, prior to 9/11, we had very little capacity. In fact, almost none. We started out in the mid-90s with some little bitty units, 10-man teams, 12 of them, that were called RAID teams. They were called that. It was radiological identification teams. And these guys, if something bad happened, they were sent up to the edge of the hole, and they were supposed to try and figure out what the heck had happened. What was, the odd parts of this event other than the explosion. That was not a very robust capacity for protecting the entire United States. Then the Marine Corps, on their own, it was an initiative of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, developed something called a Chemical Biological Incident Response Force, a CBIRF. There's a couple of acronyms here. I don't have any PowerPoint, but I do have a couple of acronyms. I am from Washington. You have to at least give me that. The CBIRF was specifically designed to provide a consequence management capability to help protect Washington, D.C., to protect the seat of our government. And these guys are active duty Marines, and they're still here. That's still one of our capabilities. And they can do technical extraction. They can go into and knock down buildings and that sort of thing, get folks out. They can do decontamination, and they can do specialized medical treatment of people who are chemical or radiological casualties. But those are two small units that we had. Now, since 9/11, we've built several capabilities. One was, or is called, civil support teams, which was another element that I visited down at Camp Dodge. There are 53 of these civil support teams. They are National Guard troops, both Army and Air Guard. There's 22 people on each team, and these guys are full-time National Guardsmen, which means they're paid for by the Department of Defense, but they still work for their governors. It's called Title 32. It's a specialized status we use for the Guard sometimes. It allows them to still do law enforcement things that the Guard can do under the command of the governor. And these guys are a extremely specialized reconnaissance element where they can go into a site of an event and figure out precisely what happened. Now, they're way beyond the raid teams who just went in and kind of sniffed around and then had to go back to labs. These guys can do this mission most of the time on site, and they do that regularly. I wrote down the CST for Iowa has one mid-grade officer who has a PhD in chemistry. So he is an actual expert that does this stuff on site, and they have in their vehicles several high-level testing capabilities that they can do, and they have computerized reach back to all the national labs so they can get almost immediate feedback on what is there. They also have an extremely robust communications capability that ties into the state and local capabilities to enhance their ability to do their job. Next, the National Guard saw that the CBRF, those Marine guys, were good, but there were very few of them. So the National Guard Bureau reached out and created something called CBRNE, right? Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear, High-Yield Explosive Emergency Response Force Packages, a SURF-P. I understand. You don't have to. There's no test on the acronyms. And these are guys, about 200 to 300 soldiers and airmen that come together that mimic that Marine Corps capability. So they can still do technical extraction, decontamination operations, and CBRNE-related medical care. Now, these guys are traditional guardsmen, so they're not on any specialized status, but they are on a much shorter string than the normal Guard units, and they are also among the first to respond should one of these events happen. Now, the CSTs in particular, the 22-man groups, those guys get called out all the time to help law enforcement officials, to help the emergency medical people. When something comes, there's some white powder somewhere at a site, these guys get called to come and help. In the ricin thing, these guys were there on site, the ones for Nevada, to help test that stuff and figure out what it was. So they're a very important asset. Now, the last part of this is the CBRNE Consequence Management Response Force, the CCMRFs. And I won't tell you the acronym, how we say that one, because everybody laughs. Well, I will. It's called a CSMRF. So everybody thinks that's rather cute for something that is going to be several thousand people that show up. These are Title X federal forces, active duty forces, that will come in under the command of Northern Command should something happen as the state and local assets start to get used up, because in a weapons of mass destruction event, people get timed out. You run out of capacity, particularly if it's a radiologically related event. If your body can only take so many rads for your whole life, and even though you may be highly trained and skilled at doing this, once you get the right number of rads, you're done forever. We can't just send you home, give you a good night's sleep and some hot food and bring you back the next day. You are done. So we have to then come in with the federal forces to support the state and local folks. And right now we have the aggregate numbers, there are multiple task forces, and I can't mention how many because that's classified, but in the aggregate, we're talking over 15,000 troops that could be applied to either a single event or multiple near simultaneous events. This is a new capability. It is expensive, and it puts a drain on the military to have these guys standing by, but the President and the Secretary of Defense and the Congress have said, we understand it's tough, but you got to do it. The nation needs that capability. So we have developed that. Okay. Now, what can you do to help us, all right, as citizens and as the academic community? Well, first, on the academic side, we need continued research on detection, control, and response. We've got to have that. We've got to get better than we are now. We're pretty good, but we need to be better. Next, we need expanded awareness on critical infrastructure protection. And the reason we need that from folks like you is that the vast majority of America's critical infrastructure does not belong to the government. It belongs to the private sector. So I know a lot of you here are ROTC, and you may go out and work for the federal government, but the others are probably going to work for some company somewhere. We need people to be aware of that and help us in the protection of those assets. The next one is a general awareness of your surroundings and a recognition when something is not quite right. Now, I'm not talking about let's all turn into East Germany and start spying on one another. All right? Nobody wants that. One of the things that we are very, very dedicated to do is to protect the civil liberties of our citizens. The whole reason all this stuff is worth fighting for is because of the system we have. And we don't want that system to change. But you do, as citizens, have to take some responsibility for your own security and the security of those around you. If you see something that is out of whack, you need to tell someone. All right? Most of the things we have short-circuited a lot of things that could have turned into issues here in the United States. Plots, operations. Most of them were not taken down by some high-speed spy satellite or some undercover agent somewhere. Eventually, we may have turned those assets on it. But the way we found out about it at the beginning was a citizen coming to us and saying, hey, there's something wrong here. You guys need to look into this. And we do, and then one thing leads to another, and we stop the bad guys. You have to be willing to do that. And the last thing I would ask of you is when something does happen, that you need to have a cool-headedness and a refusal to be swayed by myth or politics or media-driven frenzy. You're all bright, educated people. You need to apply that brightness and that education when you read about this stuff and when you hear about it and when you communicate with other citizens who might not have the same amount of information that you do. Take that responsibility and help us when this stuff occurs and don't become part of the problem. Now, with that, I will open it up to questions. And like I said, they're free game. You can ask me anything you want, and I'll be happy to try and give an answer. Yeah.
I just have two really quick questions. Do you ever brief the president? Number two, do you or how often do you have to testify in front of Congress?
I have never personally briefed the president. Did get to have lunch sitting next to him at Crawford once when I was a military assistant. The president gets every day an intelligence brief called the Presidential Daily Brief, the PDB. It used to be given by the head of the CIA, is now given by the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI. That's his primary intelligence briefing. We have had the president over at the Department of Defense a bunch. He's generally briefed by people like the chairman and the 4 stars. And I'm far enough down the food chain that they never asked me to brief him. I've seen him briefed several times, and he's a pretty tough brief. He asks a lot of questions, and he has an ability, and I know this is sort of gets out of the myth on him, he can see to the heart of an issue pretty darn quickly. And he's focused on what's important, and if somebody starts drifting off into a bunch of minutia, he brings them right back with questions that show a pretty good depth of understanding of what's going on. As far as Congress, I've testified before Congress a couple of times. It varies with the members. There are some members that are very, very focused on this stuff, particularly when you get the National Guard involved. The congressional delegations are very closely tied with the National Guard in the state. It's one of their constituencies, and they care about what we do with them and how we use them, and they get their say. In this arena, though, Congress, frankly, has been helpful in most cases. There's resistance sometimes in our own organizations because this is a different way of doing things. We used to, in the federal government and with DOD did the away game, and other people did the home game. And sometimes DOD got called out to help. But we always did it with the capacity that we had built up to play the away game. Now Congress has told us, and several of us have been sort of beating the drum for this, and Congress basically blew away the resistance to that and said, look, we don't care whether you want to do it or not. You guys need to start budgeting and programming, training and equipping specifically for the domestic support mission, for that consequence management piece. This is not federal soldiers walking around the streets playing cops. We don't do that. The National Guard sometimes does it under the command of the governor when it's appropriate. But we get called sometimes by governors. The governor requests to the president and says, hey, we need your help, and the federal military has to step in. It's always in a supporting role, but our degree of focus in that regard is much higher now, I think appropriately so, and a lot of it is because Congress said, enough guys, we don't care about your internal food fight. The country needs you to do this, now do it, and they put it in the law. Once it's in the law, the debate's over. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You talked a number of times about the fear being more of an issue than the actual device. What kind of planning has DOD or just the government as a whole put in effect to control that fear, where there might be panics or those things?
In my personal opinion, nowhere near enough. You're talking about strategic communication at that point, getting the word out to people. If you look at HHS's plans for pandemic influenza, for any of these kind of big events, and you look at the statistics they have for casualties, there's always a whole bunch of people dead and a whole bunch of people wounded, and then this huge number of worried well. That's the term of art for those. People that think there's something wrong with them, and they show up at the hospitals or at the medical places to try and get help, and it totally screws up the medical system. Well, they're just people that are scared. So it's a huge issue, and in Bucci's humble opinion, the strategic communications performance of the federal government has been abysmal since 9/11. We can sell, as they like to say, snowballs to Eskimos, but we can't sell the truth to people. We're just terrible at it, and I don't understand it. I'm not in the strategic communications business. All I recognize as an operator is that we don't do it very well. People don't believe us when we talk, and what we say just doesn't seem to ring true, even when it's 100% accurate. But we've got to get that kind of public education has to be done. We've got to recruit the American people to get behind these endeavors. Everybody points back to World War II. Everybody had victory gardens and all this stuff. Well, we don't need victory gardens in this particular war, but we definitely need the American people to be players in it. And we have not broken the code on how to recruit the American people into this effort. If we did that, we'd do a lot better job with keeping down that fear levels. People would be more educated and involved. I wish I could tell you a better answer than that, but it's something everybody recognizes as an issue and a problem, and they keep telling me, yeah, we're having meetings about it, which is not a very satisfying answer to anybody, because you got to do more than that. Yes?
Well, this is kind of related. I was in New York City in 9/11 and through for a few years after that, and I know there were a few things that happened that never made the papers. I know that the FBI found a semi-truck full of fertilizer explosives in
Uh,
this kind of thing? I would think people would like take more precautions and leave the government more if when there was a threat they actually knew it had been there.
It is always a difficult decision when you thwart something. Do you want to publicize it so you can say, gee, we stopped this one because that helps you? Do you want to try and get some benefit of the educational point that you're making? Hey, look, there are threats out there. Or do you want to lowball it so you don't, build the bad guys up to be 10 foot tall? I'm not sure we've always made the right decision on how we handle those. A personal one, my father-in-law lives in Davenport still, and he used to beat me up right at the beginning of the thing post 9/11 because he said, "Oh, you federal guys, you got to stop doing this." He plays golf on the Rock Island Arsenal, right, which is right there next to Davenport. It's a federal facility, but it's a commercial country club now, and but he has to go through the gate to get over there and show his ID card and go through all that federal craziness whenever you come on and off the post. And it really annoyed him. And he said, there's no threat out here. You guys need to stop doing that. Well, frankly, there was a threat out there. I couldn't tell him that at the time because it was classified. So it's a difficult decision to make. What do you advertise? What don't you advertise? And as the answer I gave, I don't think we've always made the right decision on how we've handled it.
Okay, we're going to wrap up now. We have reservations with the two at Legends, but any of you are welcome to come. We reserve the skybox, and we'll be having dinner with Dr. Duchamp. He'd love to answer any more of your questions, so if you'd like to come with those questions. Thank everybody for coming, and let's give Dr. Bucci a great round of applause.